Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second edition of the AAM EdCom Virtual Book Club. I'm Alyssa Frankel, the EdCom Communications Chair, and today's Hangout Master. I'm going to be troubleshooting and doing tech support for the Hangout, so you'll see me pop up occasionally. Just to give you a couple of pointers before we start the formal part of the program. You are using a Google Hangout, which I imagine many of you are using for the first time. We are broadcasting live on YouTube, so you'll be able to go and watch this after the fact. But we also want your participation in the Hangout today. So we'd like you to use the Q&A box, which as you're watching this, you should see the right-hand side of your screen. You'll be able to type in questions to the bottom of that box, and we'll be able to answer them for you throughout the chat. If you don't like that interface very much, you can also use the main event window. There's a comment box there, and we'll be looking at comments there. If you prefer to use Twitter, we're also using the hashtag #EvalHangout, that's EVAL Hangout. And we look forward to all of your questions and your comments throughout the Hangout. And I'm going to turn it over to Megan.
Welcome, everybody, to our second Google Hangout. And this is a co-production of EdCom as part of AAM and Roundtable. And today's Hangout, we're going to be looking at the newest edition of the Journal of Museum Education. I got mine in the mail, which is very exciting. Empowering museum educators to evaluate. I'm going to hand it over to our presenters here in just a moment, but first I just want to tell you a little bit about EdCom. We're the Alliance of Museums Education Professional Network, and we advance the purpose of museums in placing lifelong learning and advocate a diverse audience and educators. We promote professional standards and excellence in practice of museum education. And we are looking at fostering next best practices. And we do this by sponsoring national awards, professional development, putting up the most up-to-date information through our newsletter, providing opportunities for networking and opportunities at the annual meeting, like coming up in Atlanta. So in order to serve more of our members in an easy format, we've put together these virtual book clubs, hoping to provide a venue for discussing current issues and articles like today, and encouraging conversation amongst our presenter members, a point of contact with our organization, and this is a casual and conversation-based program. Enjoy today, and what I'm going to do is let our presenters introduce themselves, but we have with us Joy Kubarek, who is at the Shedd Aquarium, and also Laureen Trainer, who's with Trainer Evaluation, and then finally our moderator today is Lynn Dierking from Oregon State University, who is also an AAM National Associate. So I'm going to hand it over.
Thank you, Megan. So as Megan said, my name is Joy Kubarek. I'm the Vice President of Learning at Shedd Aquarium. Previously, I actually started the Learning, Planning, and Evaluation Department here at the aquarium a few years ago. So I have a special kind of interest and passion for evaluation, and I'm excited to be able to do that today. In addition to my role at the aquarium, I'm actually on the board of directors for the Museum Education Roundtable. I've been on the board since 2011. So though my year is almost up and rolling off the board this year, I'm looking forward to staying engaged with MER. MER has been collaborating with EdCom on these virtual book clubs. I think this is our second one with them. The Museum Education Roundtable, similar to EdCom, is really dedicated towards connecting museum education professionals in the field, really helping to advance this profession. And through the years, as Lynn could probably attest to later, this field really has progressed, and we continue to advance and to refine our practice. The Journal of Museum Education is published by the Museum Education Roundtable, and this is really a great resource for pulling together these different voices, both practitioners and researchers alike, and hopefully more conversation amongst professionals this field. And we hope that today is just one of those outlets for the conversation, but we hope that conversation keeps going. So I think we'll share more information if you want to stay connected to Museum Education Roundtable or to receive the Journal of Museum Education. So with that, I'll hand it over to Laureen.
Thank you. So I am Laureen Trainer of Trainer Evaluation. I am a one-woman consulting firm in Denver, Colorado. I work with museums and libraries to provide evaluation and evaluation capacity building services. And I've been involved in the evaluation field since 2007. But prior to that, I was a museum educator for 10 years. So like Joy, I have that dual side career. And it was really why I was so excited to work on this issue with Joy and the other authors, and why putting this together was so important to me, in that it pulled together both aspects of my career. It allowed me the chance to work with so many people that I respect in the field. But I kept trying to think back, about 10, 12 years now, of when I was a museum educator, and my board came to me for the first time. Yeah, we should evaluate, and I looked at them in terror. I'd never done evaluation. It was very daunting, and I like to think that this issue of the GAME is a resource that I would have needed, and that it would have been much loved on my desk. So that was kind of my goal in trying to create this version of the GAME, was to help those people that are, and so you don't have to be quite as scared about evaluation. And then I'll turn that over to Lynn.
Great. I'm really delighted to be here and joining this group. As was alluded by Joy, I'm actually in my 35th of my career, and I started out museum educator, and actually during part of that time I also was on. I was there when the Journal of Museum Education was roundtable reports, and was nice white paper, but white paper nonetheless. It's wonderful for me to be a part of this particular forum, because I feel like I've made a full circle, and it's really wonderful to have the MER connection, but the EdCom connection as well. And to I'm finishing up a year of being a national associate, and so this is a really fitting way, I thought, to end the year, and looking forward to seeing many people at AAM. And we probably should say we're going to cram as much as we can into 1 hour, but AAM meeting if there are other questions that you have. I just want to say I'm on the line, but we decided that when one talks about evaluation, it just brings out the rosiness in everyone. So anyway, I'm thrilled to be a part of this this session.
Hi folks, this is Alyssa Frankel, and your Hangout tech support person for the day and the EdCom Communications Chair. I apologize for all the technical difficulties we had at the beginning of the program. We are live and rolling now, and we hope that all of you are already enjoying the program. We really want you all to be part of the broadcast today and be able to ask your questions, share your comments. We have the Q&A app enabled on the Hangout, and you'll be able to see that on the right-hand side of your screen as you're watching the Hangout. You can type in whatever questions you have, and Megan will pick up and share them with our presenters. If you prefer to use Twitter, I'm also keeping an eye on the eval hangout hashtag. That's EVAL Hangout, and we'll be looking forward to your questions and comments there. See you in a bit.
All right, so before we get started with the Q&A portion of this session, I wanted to lay a little bit more of the groundwork about how this issue even came to be. Also share a little bit about kind of the intention behind how the issue is organized and the different kinds of articles were specifically kind of curated for this issue. The issue actually started out of an idea from a colleague who wanted to write a book about evaluation for museum education. And the book idea was really intended to bring forth practical kind of tips and techniques for evaluating in museum education, but then inserting these case studies. Well, long story short, the book didn't happen, but a lot of the authors were already identified or already had a lot of interest in putting out these case studies, and we all recognize the value of sharing our peers, the importance of kind of learning from each other, and just bringing this topic of evaluation to the forefront. So Laureen and I kind of put our heads together and thought, you know what, we do want to make this happen. Where would be a good outlet for these case studies to still be shared? So of course the Journal of Museum Education haven't really done a case study collection like this before, so it was a little bit of a new pitch for them. So we talked to some of the authors to see if they were still interested, and the two of us talked about what topics would be relevant as kind of a how-to, sort of a tool in your toolbox, so to speak, museum educators to use. So we had to identify a couple other topics and potential authors to contribute to it. Shared that idea with the Museum Education Roundtable, and they gave some feedback, and eventually the issue was approved as being something that was really valuable to put out there in the field. So that's kind of the genesis and how it's organized.
Yeah, so after we decided to go ahead with this issue, we had a set of case studies from the original book, plus a few authors that Joy and I had contacted that we thought would help to kind of round everything out. And now we're looking at about 11 to 14 different articles and wondering, okay, now what? What was the structure that would weave everything together? So we needed to find a way to conceptualize the story that would resonate with museum educators who are looking to explore the museum world. So it needed to have a little hook to it, it needed to be friendly, and it needed to be about evaluation, which is when it hit us that why not use the process of evaluation planning and execution as our narrative arc. So when we essentially the evaluation process, you start in the beginning with the scope, you've got ethics, methodologies, you share, you grow. And we realized that this would create a really, we thought, interesting structure so that someone who got the JME and read it from beginning to end would not gather some practical advice along the way from different practitioners, but they would literally read their way through the evaluation process. So they're not only reading, but they're actually getting even kind of a different layer of experience and knowledge on top of that. And if people didn't read the journal from start to finish, I know that's not actually how I approach journals oftentimes, the idea was that we would then break it down into 3 sections and that you could hone in on one section that was relevant to you and where you were in this process. So that if you just read that one section, you could still come away with a new idea, a new approach, or a new way of thinking about bringing evaluation into your institution. And so from there, we created the 3 overarching sections of how do you start, how do you share, and how do you grow.
All right, so with that, I'll give a little bit of background on the first section of how do you start, and then we're going to hand it over to Lynn to start kind of initiating some questions here. So as Laureen kind of laid out, we have those 3 sections: how do you start, how do you share, and how do you grow. The how do you start section is really one that, again, I'm very passionate about because, as you've heard from many of the people on this Google Hangout already, we've all come into this field at different starting points, and a lot of us haven't started as evaluators, we've started as educators. So that question of how do you have an educator start that may not have any experience with evaluation is a really critical one. So the first article is really about kind of establishing that culture of evaluation, really helping educators even understand the importance of evaluation and what that means to their practice. And more so, the years have kind of learned, you know, what aspects of that approach work or don't work in terms of capacity and establishing that culture of evaluation for the aquarium. The second article from Ellie Wood is a really critical kind of foundational article highlighting, you know, how to even identify the proper questions. Sometimes you ask the wrong questions. They don't actually answer really the essence of what's going to help you as a museum educator grow, help your program meet its outcomes, and so forth. So asking the right questions and asking the right of questions for needs is really important. So Ellie's article really kind of calls out how to ask the questions as well as how to identify the right small evaluation effort, medium, large, and what are the implications of each of those. The next article about ethics, it's always kind of a scary topic for a lot of us. We all have the best intentions at heart when it comes to doing evaluation and trying to understand from our learners and our guests exactly what their experience is. So as Joe Heimlich kind of points out in that article, even if we're not conducting research, which some is very academic and having a little more rigidity to it, there are certain things when we do evaluation, whether you're a professional evaluator or an educator, that you should count the well-being of those involved in your evaluation efforts. So he does a great job of trying to break down that understanding ethics is important, vital to us, and it shouldn't be a scary topic. And then finally, that last article in that how do you start section kind of is really trying to actually doing the evaluation part of this. So Amy Graff Nelson and her colleagues at the Science Museum of Minnesota talk about some of the more frequently used methods in evaluation, so different ways to collect data. And I really appreciate how at the end of the article it starts to call out weave in data collection in a way that experience. You don't want your visitors, your guests to feel like they're being tested. So in a crux, that's kind of the story of that first section is establishing the culture to actually collecting the data. And with that, I'll hand it over to Lynn.
Great, great. Something I see as a real change in the field is that certainly when I started out as an educator, actually when I started out as an educator, we weren't doing evaluation, but even when the evaluation process began to happen, it tended to be something that came from the outside. I'm really intrigued and was just so pleased as I read this issue to see this real movement towards engaging educators themselves in the evaluation process. And Joy, maybe you could talk a little bit about important in terms of our practice.
Thank you, Lynn. So as Lynn was mentioning there, it's really important for practice, not an afterthought. So personally, from my experience here at the aquarium and what I try to hungry for more knowledge and to understand whether or not they're actually being effective. So they understand kind of the very fundamentals of what evaluation is trying to get at. They're trying to their practice. They're trying to refine their skills as an educator. You want to be effective with whomever you're educating, whether that's through an exhibit space, in a summer camp program, you name it. You want to ensure that you're actually meeting the intended outcomes of that experience. Educators either don't have the time, the skills, or other resources to be able to do it. So I think what's important about this issue is to really help, kind of break down some of those hesitations, those barriers. And I firmly believe that whether you're a large organization, you need to start somewhere, and that this is important to infuse in your practice. So here at the aquarium, we kind of went through a strategic shift a couple years ago. We actually reallocating that happened to have the proper skills and experience to help with evaluation. So instead of having 12 people do our programs, we decided we can do this with 8. We'd rather have quality over quantity, and we can take help kind of establish this culture of evaluation at the aquarium. It was a lot of thought and planning. You have to get the ship for sure, and it just takes time to really establish that this is a collaboration, that evaluation is an important part of your practice, and that this empowerment evaluation approach, more of a critical friend as opposed to someone that's judging you. Some of the other things that we really tried to accomplish here at the aquarium with this change was to ensure consistency. So we that a lot we're trying to accomplish similar things, but we weren't asking the right questions, or we weren't doing anything was getting evaluated, that all educators were bought into the process, and that the educators were informing what data we were collecting and how we were collecting it, because they were there to ensure that it was a seamless experience. So again, to that point earlier that I mentioned, that like they were being tested. Learners come to these environments because it's not a threatening experience. It's not a classroom. It's not in a textbook. So when you're collecting that data, it's really important for them to still feel like it's a fun and engaging and interest-driven experience for them. So again, at the heart of the matter is just engaging educators, making sure that this is a seamless part of their practice, that it's not just an afterthought. And the more you can involve them in the planning process, data collecting, as well as kind of digesting the findings and even helping in interpretation, culture change.
That's really interesting, Joy. I know that when I was serving in a role as an external evaluator, the other piece that I often noticed is people were eager to jump into the evaluation process, but they had an important step of thinking about, for example, if they were designing a program, what success would look like, because of course what evaluation is a set of practices to help you know whether you've accomplished something. You have to be clear about what you're trying to accomplish. How have you how do you deal with that part of the process also at other institutions you're aware of?
So the easiest answer is that we've kind of adopted backward design, which to Lynn's point, you start with success. So you start with yourself, what strategies to accomplish that, and then you start to form what we at the aquarium call critical questions, and Ellie would as well, about kind of what is that starting point. What are the questions that you want to know and you need to know? Experienced here that we're asking too many questions. So I think to the point of what does success look like, what are questions that will then feed back into that loop in your program, or applying what you've learned from that one program to another program. So we really try to emphasize.
That's great. Actually, just one final question, and then we probably should move in. We're focusing on how you start, but we want to figure. I'm noticing as people are signing in. Thanks for doing that, everyone. We've got a variety of sizes of institutions. Sometimes people will say, well, they've got all these educators. Of course they can do this, and I was delighted about in the issue is that there is some effort to talk about smaller institutions. But could you call out maybe a couple of tips for people who might be working in smaller institutions?
It was saying that I work at smaller institutions as well. So I used to work at the Great Lakes Aquarium in Duluth. I coordinated programs, events, and Fish Fest, and all that. So I've been there. I definitely have done a lot of talks about this, just getting started, and I want people to know that I totally get it. I think one of the first bits of advice is just ask a question. Even one question. You've got to start somewhere. Start with a question, the program, and what if to be a sophisticated question. But what is nagging at you? What's kind of keeping you up at night? Yes, there's all kinds of different data collection there. I see that Sarah Kahn from Science Museum of Minnesota signed on, and she contributed to one of those articles with Amy. And it can be really informal interviews, asking your program participants, your learners, questions, and really thinking thoughtfully what they're saying that means to you as a practitioner. So I think you can start very basically. The other thing I put a plug in for is there's lots of different websites out there with resources. There's betterevaluation.org, which has lots of really usable resources. Informalscience.org, if you're in science fields, has evaluation reports and research reports and different conversations about methods. So Laureen helped kind of curate annotated bibliography at the end of this issue with additional resources that might be useful. So you're not in this alone. You have to start. Ask even just one question, even use just one method. Ask your learners questions. My advice is do something, don't do nothing.
Thanks. A little bit, now we've done we got started, and we have done some work. We have some findings. A really important part of this process, particularly I think when we're trying to do that feedback into practice, share what we've learned. So can you talk a little bit about that section of the issue?
Sure, and it's absolutely right. You just have to take that first step, but then you have to take the next step too. It's one of those processes that's ongoing. So you've decided you're going to evaluate. You've got your scope, your questions. You've considered ethics and methodologies. You've collected data. And most likely you have some sort of results that came out of that data. And the results are so important, and that is the next step, to take it beyond just asking people. So your results can help shape current programs, help inform future programming, questions that an institution might have around learning. Are people learning? How are they learning? Participation in the museum, in the exhibits, in the conversation. It can help you learn about your community. And these are all things your boss, your funder, your colleagues, your trustees, they need to know about. And so the next really important part of the process is not letting those results sit in a corner, in a pile of surveys in the corner, not having a report sit on a shelf. And so there's two short case studies. The first one was one that I had contributed about different ways to think about formatting your data. And thinking about formatting data in a way that resonates with clients. And I know that most of you listening today are members and not contractors, and you're saying, I don't have clients. But I would actually say when it comes to sharing results, you should think of everybody as a client. Your boss is a client, your colleague is a client, because essentially you have a new piece of information that you need to sell to them. You need to let them know why it's important, how you're going to implement it, what changes can come out of this. And unfortunately, traditional reports, generally speaking, are not the best way to sell information. And so my case study just highlights a few examples of how a little bit of knowledge about adult learning theory, graphic design can come together in a way that can produce a much more dynamic and informative report that hopefully won't be gathering dust. So it gives a few examples of ways to think about sharing results. And then Allison Price and crew from the Lincoln Park Zoo also did a really interesting case study in preparation for a new exhibit that they'll be building at the Lincoln Park Zoo. They did an evaluation. It's great. And so Allison provides a little bit of a roadmap for you. So she gives the question, she provides their methodology and the results, but most of the information they gathered impacted the team making decisions about the future exhibit and how changes happened, because once they heard from visitors, they had to realize that maybe they should do it this way, or think about something different. And then Allison also gives some tips on making data-driven decisions in your institutions based on her experience working with that team. And then because the section is a little short, we'll just go into how do we grow, and then we can take that as a whole. But as the last section, as Joy and I were thinking about this, we wanted to show ways that you can start to grow in relation to evaluation, and that means internally and externally. And so we came up with 4 ideas of how we think are 4 different possibilities of how you can grow. And in the first instance, comes from Angie and Christina from the Pacific Science Center. And one of the things that Joy had just mentioned is sometimes you can actually ask too many questions and do too many surveys and you have too much data, and it's actually not helping anybody at that point. And so what Angie and Christina gave a case study is that's exactly what happened to them. And they walk you through the way that they streamlined both the process of evaluation, like on the other side when they did that. Then Lauren Silver and Scott Berg provided a case study. Lauren Silver is the internal staff member at the Computer Museum. Scott Berg is an external consultant. And this is a way to grow, is to start bringing in external evaluators that can generally help you with projects that might be a little too big for your internal resources, for your internal time, and sometimes for your internal expertise. Lauren and Scott wrote this a little bit said, so there's kind of her perspective on what she wanted from the evaluator, and then there's Scott's perspective of coming in as an external evaluator, and the questions that they navigated, and they both provide their perspectives on that question related to this project. Another way to think about growing is with a local university. That's actually a great option for many of us. It seems easy, right? You know, there's students that want practicum hours, got a space, it's free labor, get evaluation results, but it doesn't quite work like that. So and who have been doing this for a while and have great evaluation reports on this, offer some sage advice on entering into this form of to make sure that the museum, the intern, the university all benefit from that relationship. And then the last way that Joy and I offered up as an example of a way to grow is with Marley's case study. Marley of the Denver Zoo talked about the Denver Evaluation Network, which is a form of growth that took place as a 15 museum network. And what these museums did to get themselves to building evaluation capacity within themselves, within the group, and within their institutions. And then as part of that, they're going to be brought into a larger area. But Marley gives some really informative background information about how the group came together and network. But perhaps more importantly, she spells out the lessons learned in terms of how to keep a network together. What does it look like to keep 15 different institutions working together?
That sounds wonderful. I want to make sure that people who are particularly involved, so I've got a series of questions that I can ask, but I wondered, I know Megan's been seeing if any questions are coming from. Megan, are there any questions that you'd like to share with Joy or Laureen?
Somebody made a comment about grants and funders being drivers of evaluation, you know, for some of us, and maybe they're the reason why we start, or they might be the reason why we grow. So I was just wondering if any of you want to address, you know, reporting to our grantors.
So I'll step. So the one piece of advice I would say is, again, not to soapbox for the how do you start, but evaluate even before you get a grant, because it will help you get a grant. When writing a proposal for a grant, they want to see that you've demonstrated that you've been able to meet your outcomes, and that you're already kind of embedding this practice in, so to speak. So first of all, I would say do it even before you have a grant. In terms of working, you know, with a funder once you have a grant and reporting back out. Every funder has different expectations for what they're hoping to get in terms of a report. Some are looking mostly at outputs. So outputs is like the number of students in a program, the number of activities you did in the park as part of a program. Outputs don't necessarily indicate, outputs are still important to track and report on, but are much different than outcomes. Sometimes, and hopefully more so nowadays, they're looking at the outcomes. So what is the change? What resulted from people participating in that program? You can differentiate the difference between those two and be able to speak to that in a report. You know, the funders will appreciate that. So what Laureen was saying with kind of how to communicate your findings and to do that in a way that's engaging. Granted, most funders want a written report, but I challenge us to put in there some more visuals, or to put in there reporting in a way that's easier for them to see very quickly and immediately what the impact of that program was, and as a result of their funding. A lot of funders don't have time used and what happened as a result of it. So that would be a quick tidbit. And Laureen, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, just two quick things off of that. A lot of times evaluation does start in institutions because of funders, and if there's just an impetus that you need to get you started, maybe funding is that impetus. And then hopefully that starts to build that culture of evaluation once you realize, oh wait, this not only satisfied a requirement, it actually helped us learn. And it's going to help us improve things both internally and for our visitors. So it might be the way you start, but it certainly not necessarily a bad thing. And I think what you touched on is, so your funders are your they just gave you a lot of money and they want to know how you spent it. I do think it is one of those things, it's really hard to be that first institution that doesn't hand them a 200-page summative report. But I think, like you said, you should be the first 200-page summative report. That actually doesn't help anybody. That's just checking off a box to say that I met requirements. It really is starting to be more clever, more resourceful in the way that you present information. I know Museum of Nature and Science, we had an IMLS grant, so federal government, big grant, obviously has a lot of reporting requirements. And for my interim reports, I totally changed the formatting. I made huge 3-inch margins on the left hand, had a lot of white space, a lot of quotes, and you know what? They accepted it. It's not like we lost funding over it. I do this differently. And I like to think that by doing it a little differently, you actually stand in the funding community because you're trying to explain yourself in an overall informative manner. So be nice to your funders. They don't like to read reports any more than anybody else.
And again, it depends on the funder. You really should read who your funder is and what they're going to respond to. But we've been trying more to put the program participants, or we call them learners here, put their voices. Documentation is a great way of capturing data now with programs, and having your participants, do diaries. Get permission. So to Joe Heimlich's article, get permission from them first. But if you can share those videos participants made themselves, or photos of the participants, I mean, that's much more telling than text in a report. Be creative and really show very firsthand, here's how that their funding supported the program, and look at the outcomes from the voice of the learner rather than the voice of the educator or an evaluator. So really, challenge to be creative, I would say.
Issue that the trend I'm seeing also in evaluation of more community participation models. We have a project right now in Portland where we actually have hired high school age youth to help us collect data and help be the really the informants about the community that they live in. We actually live in that community, and I think that's really, really important. So I also have a question just in general that even when you write is something that I've noticed over the years is that sometimes institutions build in the time to actually talk about the findings and to really think what those mean project, but for future efforts as well. And I wondered if the two of you could maybe talk about some models, how to make sure that those findings don't stay in even the beautiful report, but actually make their way into effective practice.
Any from the Shedd. And I guess I would just start with the idea of why is it important that we share them? And I think so your findings are essentially the voice of your visitor. And that's why they're so important. And so when we're making a team in a museum, we might have a reader and an educator and a marketer and a collections manager, and maybe admin sitting around the table, all making decisions for the visitor without the visitor actually having a voice at the table. And that is what evaluation, it's putting the visitor at the table and giving them a role and a voice in the decision making. And so that's, I guess, why I would just encourage you to make sure that you do fight and you do just the report. I guess the squeaky wheel. So don't be afraid of the squeaky wheel that is like, do you remember that finding? Do you remember, that report that we did? And don't be afraid to bring it up at meetings and to always reference it and remind people that this is the visitor speaking. Like Joy said, being pretty creative. I've done a lot of video reports. It's a 90-second video that people can watch. It's unexpected. People react to something that's unexpected. It catches their attention. Food. I've bribed people with food before in terms of trying to get them to pay attention. Theatrics. I have stood up in meetings and reenacted something and probably made a total fool out of myself, but it was all in the guise of evaluation findings across. So don't let it die. Keep coming back to it and just try to find those unexpected ways to insert the voice in the conversation. A few ideas.
Really sure that we had this this culture shift, and that evaluation was really part and parcel to everything we did. Couple ways that we did that. So first is to establish an evaluation plan of sorts, which we developed a template for it, but essentially the evaluation plan is outlining what's the program, who's the audience, what are the outcomes, and then how are you going to answer your critical questions, and what are those critical questions. Every single program has to have an evaluation plan. It's the same as writing a program outline or a lesson plan, whatever you call it internally at your organization. Just as you require someone to document what their lesson is, we're with the evaluation place. And again, we have some staff in evaluation because again, all of our educators are part of the evaluation process. So if anyone asks how many evaluation staff do you have, I say 30 because we have 30 eds. So anyway, the educators know that when they're planning the program, they're meeting with their teammate to talk about, you know, what are we going to do with this high school marine biology program this year? While they're asking that question, they go back to either last year's evaluation finding program. Okay, what's the evaluation plan for this moving forward? Another piece that we've inserted to, again, make sure that evaluation is part of this is every program has staff reflections as one of the data points. So we ensure that everything is triangulated. We have more than one data, but one of the sources of data is a staff reflection. So every single educator that does a program treats questions of meeting those outcomes. Prompt our staff to really describe, well, I saw us meeting this outcome of, you know, students interpreting data and forming explanations when we were out in the field and they were doing an ethogram and then this chart and then talking about it and making inferences based on that data about the behavior of the birds. So another piece, we share every single evaluation report with our senior leadership. So we're sharing those reports with our directors, our vice presidents, and so forth. So we push it out. It's up to them whether they're going to read it or not, but we basis so they know that everything is being evaluated. And again, to Laureen's point earlier about communication, we put at the very top, if senior leadership only has 1 minute to look at that report, they can see from the very first page what key findings were. And similarly, we started to put our key findings on our website. So that way the educators see that we're putting this out there, we're being very transparent and public about it. And we are always updating our website when we have a new program open or a deadline is passed. So that's a nice reminder of, oh yeah, we need to put our evaluation findings for that program there. And we're using that as another way to hopefully recruit people for a program. They can see that we're outcome driven and that we're true to our word. If we see this is the experience you're going to have and this is what you're going to get out of it, we're following that up with, we're actually measuring that, we're assessing to see what we're actually doing. So those are just a few of the ways that we've kind of put in safeguards that it's just an integral part of how we operate.
That's great. We talked quite a bit about sharing findings within institutions. I think that something that's really exciting to me about this issue are the cases of trying to share both the process and the findings of evaluation studies with others. If you could just speak to avenues for getting information out and why it's important to share evaluation findings among institutions. I'll let you remember who gets to answer first.
I'll go first and then Joy obviously follow up. So in terms of sharing outside, and okay, you're trying to bring the visitor voice into the conversation. I think when you're sharing externally, it's reminding people why museums and institutions are important. So there is a lot of public discourse happening in your neighborhood right now. There's you know, initiatives that are happening within a community. There are political issues, economic issues, and that's actually all happening outside of your museum. And I think it's so important for museums to be part of that discourse and to insert themselves into the public discourse. And they do that oftentimes by sharing evaluation results, demonstrating why they're important to the community. They can demonstrate that they're a place of learning, a place of play, a place where people change and grow and adapt new attitudes and behaviors. And that is all integral to being part of the fabric of a community. And you then become part of that discourse along with politicians, become part of that discourse along with other nonprofits, other corporations. And that without being part of that discourse, I think you're in a pretty precarious. And it's evaluation findings that allow you to come in and prove, quantify, and come to the table in a different way than you can without them. And so I guess I'll just let Joy maybe come up with some examples of how she's done it, but I think I would just up as why it's important to make sure that you're bringing the visitor voice in internally, but then you're bringing the museum perspective out as part of the community around you.
And I just wanted to warning.
Okay. So to piggyback off of what Laureen was saying, you know, this idea of being our own advocates, I think, is really important. It's important for us to value within the community. You know, there's Museum Advocacy Day. I think every day should be Museum Advocacy Day. And if we have our evaluation findings to demonstrate what that impact is making, you know, be loud and proud about that. Be ready and equipped to share that in conversations within your own community, your region, and so forth. I know easier said than done, perhaps, but find those outlets and really be a voice for your museum, and being, you know, part of this evaluation process and having findings to pull from will be really important, so that it's not just your bias working for the museum trying to convince someone that you're valuable. You actually have data to support what you're saying. Also, you know, I think it's really important for us outside of your organization is important so that we can all learn from each other. I mentioned in my article about this evaluation kind of toolkit we have. I am just blown away by how many people email and call, and they're like, I want to know, like, what is this toolkit? Can I access it? How do you hesitant to share their methods, to share their... I have really been a very strong supporter of us sharing the work we do and use it here, and it might not always be the perfect fit for your organization, but at least it'll inspire you and hopefully be able to share that outside of our own four walls. People are just going to be left grappling with these questions of, well, where do I begin and how did they do it? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. You know, we've all been in this varying degrees and in various ways, so I think sharing outward is important for that kind of peer support. In terms of outlets to do that, again, put it on your website if you can. I know every place might have some different through in terms of how much ownership they have of their organization's website, but you know, share things on the website. You know, it's one of the only peer-reviewed journals for museum educators, and it really is trying to invite both academics and practitioners to conversation and to contribute as authors. It's actually a conversation we've been having in MER is how do we get more practitioners, more museum educators to contribute, to have an MED or a PhD behind your name to submit. It's really, and there's lots of conferences, both you know, locally as well as nationally, that are trying to be more open for evaluation studies. Studies Association is a great place to start. The AAM, you know, the mark of the theme was all around research and evaluation. So there's different ways to get it out there. There's definitely a lot of different outlets. But I think that the one challenge there that you need to consider is the time to do it. So we're kind of saying this is important here at the outlets, but you really need to make the time on your schedule just to look at what are some venues for sharing your evaluation findings. You know, really just try to make it happen, which I know is easier said than done, but that's the one kind of little bit of advice I put out there.
That's great. I just wanted to add that there's a great conversation going on in the question and answers, and I just one of the ideas, which I've been hearing a great deal, is the importance of sharing when things don't work. And not always, unlike me, having a rosy picture to your findings, but being willing to share when things don't work out as one intended. So we've only got a very few minutes, but I've talked about that quite a bit.
I know we need to wrap up, but that caught my eye, and actually just the last thing for me, the National Association of Research and Science Teaching was just here in Chicago, and we actually did just that. We were doing evaluation on our teen learning lab and found somebody like Lynn, but it was for us to learn from that and to there. So we actually presented on, the theory's not translating into practice as best as it could. So don't be afraid. So we have to learn.
So you obviously have to tackle the good and the bad, but just again thinking about how part of sharing your results is how do you share about your approach. you don't want to just come in there and clobber people over the head with, well, this was a failure, and then move on. So thinking about how to share that in a very constructive manner. So but how can we brainstorm ways to move forward? What did we see in the results that might give us some idea of how to change this and make this part of an iterative process? So didn't quite work, we thought it did, but it didn't, so now we're going to change something, we're going to evaluate it again, we're going to come back to it, and it becomes part of a learning conversation as opposed to a failure in a way that's appropriate for the results and for the stakeholders.
To see that it's the Sigrid I thought it might be from Colombia. Thanks for joining us, Sigrid.
So it looks like the questions that I saw come up from the chat were just kind of, people were asking about some basic, like how they format things, using SurveyMonkey or not. Do you guys have some links or some places online you'd send people for some of those really basic getting started instruments, things like that?
Yeah, well, gosh, a lot of a little bit at the end of the journal that gives some webinars that are open for people, some articles, some websites, and some blogs in terms of places to that might help bring some of that in. When it comes to SurveyMonkey or QuickTap or, gosh, I can't remember, there's a lot out there. Most of them have free trials. I just sign up, play around with it a little bit, see if there's an interface that's maybe a little more intuitive for you. They are about 99% the same and 1% different in terms of how they operate. So you just have to find the one that's right for you, and that might be whether some can work with Wi-Fi, some don't work with Wi-Fi. That might be a consideration. There's some pricing plans, and this is all part of that. Taking that first step is just ask that first question, send out that first email survey. One of the things I just would say beforehand is it's really easy to test your ideas in about 15 minutes before you actually put it out there. Colleague, go out on the floor and ask 5 people to take a survey, and about 99% of the problems will pop up in those 5 minutes. So if you can do that little bit of work beforehand, it might pay a lot of dividends on the end.
I know we're out of time, so I'll just echo. Again, I go to betterevaluation.org is a great site. Informalscience.org is another great site. But like I said, it's pretty easy to just test your approach real quickly and see if it'll work or not. So, but yeah, definitely look at the end of the issue as well for ideas, and just reach out, talk to your colleagues. There's lots of listservs.
Great. Well, I want to thank our presenters today. Thank you to Lynn, to Joy, Laureen. This was a great conversation. Thank all of the tech support, and thank all of you for participating today. And you will be able to find this chat on YouTube. And just look out for more virtual book clubs. There should be another one coming up in the fall.
And one last thing before we let you all go, there is an evaluation for the evaluations and letting us know how we can create better professional development for you all as EdCom, the Museum Education Roundtable. And the link has been shared a couple times in the question box. It's also been shared on the event page for the Hangout. And we would, again, definitely appreciate you taking that survey. Thank you all again for your time. And we will see you in Atlanta.